Do you love your adventure bike but sometimes wish that seat was just a little bit lower? Hi, Tony here and welcome to The Cave. If you've watched the channel, you will know that I recently bought myself a KTM adventure bike. Now I wanted to lower that bike. Here's how and why I did it, and for a change I've done this in a kind of MotoVlog style. I'm just on my way to see the guys at FTR Suspension at a place called Beasley End in Essex, which is just a couple of miles away from me, through some nice country roads. A bit wet and soggy today. FTR Suspension are, as the name would imply, a suspension specialist, and these were the guys that I went to talk to when I was considering what options I had to lower the KTM Adventure. Now, I didn't want to go too low. I didn't really have too many problems with the height of the bike. I'm 5'10" with a 32-inch inside leg, so I could fit the balls of my feet quite comfortably on the ground. But what I found is when it came to manoeuvring on the bike, I ended up going up onto my tiptoes if I wanted to sort of push it backwards or something. And I found that out when parked in a country lane. I did a turnaround on a gravel track, tried to push myself back, lost my foot in and almost dropped the bike, and decided that it was probably worthwhile trying to shave some height off it. I looked at a few options. Obviously the most straightforward option is to put a lowered seat on. Now, KTM don't offer a lower seat option for their bikes. In actual fact, if you go for one of their replacement ergo seats, they sit somewhere between 15 and 20 millimeters higher than the stock seat, which just, you know, exacerbates the problem. Touratech make a lowered seat, but that is in excess of £400. And you still then have the problem that your legs become a little bit more scrunched up, but obviously the rest of the bike stays the same. So that's one option. So I went along to the guys at FTR, had a chat to talk about what my options were, and they suggested replacing the shock for a slightly shorter shock. In that way I could not only lower the height of the bike, but I could also improve the suspension. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the white power suspension on the rear of this bike, but you've got to remember that this 1050 Adventure was built at a particular price point, so it is just a straightforward emulsion shock. It's well constructed. I've got nothing bad to say about white power products. There's no real problem with emulsion shocks per se. They work effectively, and they're pretty smooth initially. If they're overworked, they can struggle a little bit. It's just one of the hazards of riding around the Essex countryside. FTR work with all the major brands. They're one of the country's leading Olin specialists. They work with Andriani, and while I was talking to James there, he suggested, as my budget was a little bit tight, looking at Nitron, and he suggested that they could provide a much improved shock over what I had on the bike already. Set to the size that I needed, already pre-set up for my weight and for the bike, and it would come in cheaper than something like the Olin. So that was what we went for. He took a few measurements. We decided through trial and error on the bike how much we wanted to take out of the height, and then the order went in, and it took about three or 4 weeks, I guess, given that there was Christmas in between, for the guys at Nitron to get the shock built. I've had a call to say it's in, and so I'm heading down there now to get it fitted. Now, you can put bungs and bits and pieces and spacers into shocks, and that's what FTR initially looked at doing, which was dismantling my shock and rebuilding it. But the fact that the white power shock was an emulsion shock means that that's not particularly easy to do. So we went for the replacement. Obviously the drawbacks of the replacement are it's more expensive, although having said that, you do get a better shock, and you have an issue with the side stand becoming too tall and that needing to be shortened. So there's a whole lot more to it, but I decided that the trade-off for the better performing shock was worth doing that. So as you noticed today, it's pretty wet. We're at the tail end of Storm Eleanor. I don't know when we started naming storms in the UK, but they followed that naming convention, so I'm waiting to get to the letter S so we can have Stormy McStormface, no doubt. Now I thought I was going to get my feet wet coming through here because yeah, that's pretty high. That normally floods, it becomes a ford. I've been through there before in my Land Rover where the water's been up to the headlights. This is Codham Mill, which is undergoing restoration, or has been for quite some time. I'm interested to see what the performance will be like with the shock, and just how much more manageable the bike will be. Now obviously when you're riding you're not going to really notice it. I'm going to lose about an inch. If you consider sag, I'm probably going to lose an inch and a half off the ride height, but I don't ride this in any extreme off-road situation, so I'm not really too concerned about that. I just hope that it doesn't show the front shocks up, because you've got no real adjustment on these shocks at all. So it may well be that once I've saved up a few more pennies, I can look at not necessarily changing the forks themselves, but maybe just setting a different set of cartridges fitted in there. Now FTR, these guys work with a lot of race teams, a lot of motocross riders and teams, very experienced, and the wealth of knowledge they have is very evident when you come in here and chat to the guys. It looks like there might be an interesting little test track down there that they use. Okay, here we are. FTR suspension.
And there, inside waiting for me, was the new shock, and what a beautiful piece of kit it is. Now, the actual fitting of the shock is pretty straightforward. You've obviously just got the two bolts, upper and lower, to remove, get the old shock out of the way, put the new shock in place, and then mount the cartridge to the frame with the fittings that are included in the kit. Then it's time to turn your attention to the front forks, do a lot of careful measuring and calculations, and work out how far through they need to be dropped to level everything up.
So already it's noticeable sitting on the bike. I've got my feet flat on the floor and get my heels down. When I'm pushing back, I'm up onto the balls of my feet, but not on my toes. So already there's a lot more confidence in terms of manoeuvring the bike. The change already does feel a little bit plusher, a little bit more solid than the back. I think I had a lot more sag, which obviously you can adjust, but there was a lot more sag in the stock bike than we have in this. And the guys took a lot of time with me sitting on the bike in a riding position, getting the sag, making sure everything was lined up front to back, and we're at where we should be for the factory setting. So they took measurements when the bike first went in, and then took measurements again once it was set up, and then again with me on there. So it's a very thorough service. So I'm probably not going to be able to give this a really great test. It is wet, it's greasy, it's still pretty windy, so I'm just going to have to be a little bit careful. But I'll give it a little bit run down to some of the bumpy lanes that I know. There's a little place down there. Actually, I've never been down there. A place called Rotten End. Doesn't sound that great, does it? Now I don't know what it's going to be like down here. We'll have a look. Might be a bit crappy. It's normally not that great during the summer, but this will give me I know it's pretty bumpy down here. It's dealing with these bumpy lanes quite nicely, not quite as bouncy as the old one was. I was really impressed with the build quality and the finish of the Nitron Shock. The guys took my weight and a lot of other measurements, and actually they'd sent the shock through with the preload already set up, and there was no need to actually make any adjustments to that. And James and the guys at FTR said, get out, get some mileage on it, and then we'll head back in, give them some feedback, and we can make some tweaks. The good thing about this shock is it is adjustable for length as well, so the eyelet can be moved. You've got not a lot of movement. I think you've got about 7 mil either way, but 7 mil at the shock end would account to slightly more in terms of the ride eye of the bike, so you can fine tune it, and it's just a case of making sure you get that initial base measurement correct when you order the shorter shock, because if you do go way too short or not short enough, you are limited to how that can be adjusted. So as long as you get it somewhere near, then you can amend that at a later stage. But I have to say, it's pretty damn comfortable. One thing that I've yet to mention is the actual cost. Obviously, replacing the shock for a good quality shock is not a cheap option. Oh, that's a bit wet. So in total, if you look at the price of the shock plus that, you're at about the $650 mark, which isn't cheap. There are much cheaper options to do this. Because I've still yet got to shorten the side stand, although having a brother who's a welder makes that a bit easier. So it's not necessarily the easiest or cheapest option.
Where's the squirrel though?
But for me, I think the quality of that new shock is going to outweigh the cost to a certain extent. You can also see the Halverson's advanced gloves that I recently reviewed doing a good job. For anybody interested in the setup that I'm running to film this, I've got my Nexx XD1 helmet on, which has got the built-in Sena X-comm. That's connected to a Sena GP10 Bluetooth unit, which is on the back of my trusty GoPro Hero 3. Well, now we've got some water.
I hope you enjoyed that video. I hope you found it useful. As usual, there will be links in the end credits. If you want to subscribe to me, that would be fantastic. And until the next video, I just want to say thanks for watching. Take care, ride safe, and I'll see you soon. Bye.
Yeah.